Sonna Gatto Shu Dai 72 Soku Seison Misetsu Seison Nyu Nehan ni nozonde Monju Hotokeを生じて再び法理の天是紙面とす生存として曰く我49年重世今ら一時を溶かす何時生じて我に再び法理の天是ようとこれ我かって法輪天髄や Entangling Vines Case 72. The Buddha never preached. As the Buddha was about to enter paranirvana, Manjushri asked him to turn the wheel of the Dharma one more time. The Buddha admonished him, saying, 49 years I have dwelt in the world, but I have yet to preach a single word. You ask me to turn the wheel of the Dharma once again, but have I ever turned the wheel of the Dharma? Good morning, good afternoon, wherever we may be in this world we live. Some of us in the United States, on the West Coast, some on the East Coast, some in Europe, maybe some, even though they are on this planet, in outer space. Wherever you may be, it is wonderful. And it is a privilege to be here with you together on this first day of the 2024 Rinzai-ji Hō-On Sesshin. The Sesshin, the retreat that commemorates 10 years of the departure of Kyōzan Jōshū Roshi, Denkyō-shitsu Kyōzan, the founding abbot of Rinzai-ji. And for so many of us, our ordination teacher, our primary teacher, and for all of us, our departed teacher. So here we are. Numbers don't matter, but the heart that we bring to this practice and that we bring to continuing to walk this path of the Bodhisattva, this path of no self, is really, really important. So my deep thanks to our monastics who live at Rinzai-ji, Myoren-zen-ni, Sogen-zen-ji, and the board of directors of Rinzai-ji, present, former, and future, to make it possible that we can get together and work on this project that we call walking the path of the Bodhisattva. I have the privilege to talk a little bit today, and I will try to not bore you to the umpteenth degree with what is being said here. Fortunately, the koan today is a koan that is not one of those that require me to speak a lot about the history and who appears in the koan. It's pretty straightforward today. And ultimately, we can say that any of us appear in the text of this koan. Since you may not be completely familiar with the Shumon Kattoshu, the Entangling Vines collection of koans, let me just say a little bit about it. it's a fairly substantial collection of koans that, you can see it's fairly thick, and there are almost 300 cases in here. And the difference between this collection of koans and, let's say, the classic and the well-known collections that we know as the Gateless Gate or the Gateless Barrier, like the Mumonkan, or the Blue Cliff Record, the Hikigandoroku, or even the Record of Equanimity, the Shoyoroku. It's a little bit different here by the fact that this is a collection of mostly the main cases that are found in the classical koan collections. If you think of the Blue Cliff Record, you know, every case starts with a pointer. Then you get to the Honsoku, the main case, and then comes a verse, and then comes commentary. And in the Hakuin tradition, there are many, many levels of commentaries on commentaries on commentaries of these classical koans. Shumon Katoshu, the Entangling Vines collection, is fairly straightforward. So just the main case, no pointer, no verse. You might ask, how do we end up with case number 72? Well, once one is called to talk about these classical cases, what we usually do is we select one collection and go from the top, which is case 1, to the last case. So I decided 72 cases ago to use this Shumon Katoshu because it is not as common. There are many, many Teishōs you can find on the Mumonkan, the Gateless Barrier, or the Hikigandoroku, the Blue Cliff Record, from so many, many people who have wonderful things to say about it. Shumon Katoshu is not treated that often, and it's an interesting undertaking to talk about just as the koans appear. One of the things that we learn, that I've learned through that is, well, there's no choice in it, which is the next koan. What is being talked about today is case 72. The previous Teishō I gave was case 71, and the next Teishō that will be given will be, of course, case 73. There is no choice to it. And that is a really deep lesson here. We all have functions like this in our lives where we have to respond to conditions and circumstances as they unfold right in front of our eyes, in the same way that this book opens with a specific text of a koan. And rather than spending any time on worrying about why is this so? Why that now? We develop the ability to just fully embrace what is unfolding and to develop the ability to exercise the greatest amount of freedom of conceptions, freedom of being dragged down in predilections, in likes or dislikes, and just attend to what needs to be attended to. I bet we all share the experience that there are plenty of times we could dislike what is presenting to us, but that will not make it any easier to be present with it and to act appropriately in the circumstances. Yeah. We are very lucky today that it's not the koan about Nansen, because the Rinzai-ji kitty would probably not be liking to listen to Nansen's cat. But it's nice to see that we have the freedom for the kitty to walk around. So you also should feel free to change your posture when it is necessary, so this doesn't become the most uncomfortable part of the day. Yes, today we meet the Buddha in the koan. Sesshin, the world-honored one. The world-honored one, who, according to legend, was born from the armpit of his mother, immediately being able to stand up and to point up and to point down and to speak, to take 7 steps in all the various directions and to declare Tenjō Tenge Yuiga Dokson, above and below the heavens, I alone am the world-honored one. From the Zen point of view, that, of course, can be looked at, well, that's so religious. No baby is born from armpits. No baby is able to stand up and walk around, and more than that, make a profound declaration about being the only one to be honored above the earth and below heavens. But as with so many expressions in these traditions, of course, we can look at it not from a literal point of view, but from the point of view of an expression, what is being expressed here. And that already leads me into the very core of this koan, of this case 72. The Buddha never preached. Seison mi setsu. Here we sit, we know that the Buddha did say a lot of things, you know. There we have these kinds of things, you know. We have sutras. Many of them we know, some of them we chant every day. This morning in Choka, we chanted the Heart Sutra, the heart of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra, Hanya Shingyo, as we call it. In the past, chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra was a twice daily occurrence during Sesshin at Mambaldi Zen Center, in Vienna too, or here at Rinzai-ji, the Myoho Renge Kyo, chapter 25. Other places, like at Daibosatsu Zendo, where I spend most of my time acting in this role as the shike, during Sesshin, we go through the entire Diamond Sutra. We read it in English. And we break up the roles of the 2 protagonists, who are, of course, Seison, the world-honored one, and Subhuti, asking questions between 2 readers. And it's an interesting way to experience the Diamond Sutra as a dialogue. Kongo Hanya Haramikyo, so the Diamond Sutra. How can it be then that here we encounter the saying that the Buddha never preached? Not only that, what does it say in here? Let's look at the point of time. As the Buddha was about to enter parinirvana, I'm sure you all know the Buddha's posture when he expired. These wonderful, very large statues of Shakyamuni lying on his side, resting his head on one of his arms. That was the posture that he took before he expired. And there's actually a whole sutra, the Parinirvana Sutra, that speaks about this very time. And one gatha of that Parinirvana Sutra is a very important gatha. Gatha is basically a verse that we can find in these verse-based sutras and scriptures. Who was there when he was going to expire? Of course, his closest disciples. Not unlike when Jōshū Roshi expired. Those who had taken care of him for a long time were there. And the questions actually are very similar every time we encounter such a passing of one of those teachers to whom we have dedicated ourselves as disciples. So with the historical Buddha, Mahakashyapa was there, but also Ananda, who was much younger. Ananda, who is a wonderful personality, I would even say. Anansonja had a really, really good memory. He became the receptacle of all the teachings of the Buddha and was able to recite them, as it is said, verbatim. However, we know that Mahakashyapa and the historical Buddha, they had transmission. So the Buddha transmitted to Mahakashyapa, which is famously described in case 6 of the Gateless Gate, the Mumonkan. The Buddha twirls a flower, Seison Nenge, and Mahakashyapa was the only one who smiled. So Mahakashyapa was already the next generation after the Buddha. But Ananda, although he was very bright, very astute, and had this really exceptional memory, had not yet awoken to this realization of being awake. So there's Ananda, and he was looking at his teacher, just about to die. And you can all imagine what question he would ask. O world-honored one, once you are gone, what should we do without you? Who will teach us? What will happen? All these questions. What's next? What's next? What's next? And what does it mean for me as a practitioner? And the Buddha answered with the gatha that some of us might know. Atta dipa viharata, atta sarana, ananna sarana, dhamma dipa, dhamma sarana, ananna sarana. And it's translated in many different ways. The way how I've encountered it in English is the following. Atta dipa, you are the light. Viharata, look within. Atta sarana, rely on yourself. Ananna sarana, don't rely on anything outside. Dhamma dipa, the Dharma is the light. Dhamma sarana, take refuge to the Dharma. That is what the Buddha told Anansonja. He didn't say, oh, go and study with Mahakashyapa. He knows. Attadipa, pointing to each of the disciples, each sentient being on this path, to make this endeavor about developing the trust in, of course, our innate light, our innate Buddha nature, our not having to rely on any teachings that are not illuminated from the inside with that light. Now, of course, speaking about his teachings, the Dharma, this is what he said about it, the Dhammadipa. The Dharma is the light. Dhamma sarana, take refuge in the Dharma. Not relying on anything but that. Jōshū Roshi never answered these questions, even though we might have asked them. He did not leave anyone behind either, or pointed to anyone. Oh, go and study with so-and-so. But he might have expressed it in a different way. In one of the last Daiseshin that I had the privilege to participate in at the Bodhimanda Zen Center in New Mexico, in the last Sanzen, one thing that Jōshū Roshi would just repeat over and over again was, never, never stop practicing. Never, never stop practicing. Never, never stop practicing. So here, this koan and the scene that we went through 10 years ago is very much alike. And it is very apropos for this koan to appear at this very point in the Shumon Katoshu and in how the calendar happens to line up. I very often find that this is just how it works out. The appropriate koan appears at the appropriate time and is asking for an appropriate elaboration of it. So here, I don't know if it was before or after Ananda asked the Buddha about what to do, Manjushri appeared. It's probably after, with the Buddha closer to dying, because, well, Manjushri, we know Ananda was probably a real person, but Manjushri is not. Manjushri is the expression in the Buddhist teaching of specific properties of wisdom and so on. Manjushri. I'm sure you all have seen a statue of Manjushri. Quite often when you go to Buddhist temples with Shakyamuni in the middle, you have two more statues on the right and on the left. Monju Bosatsu, which is, of course, Manjushri, and Fugen Bosatsu, Samantabhadra. And both of them often appear riding on animals. Manjushri also is quite easy to spot, because usually in his hand he holds a flaming sword, a sword that sticks up straight. In the right hand he's holding that, and that sword is meant to depict his realization of this transcendent wisdom that cuts through ignorance and cuts duality into one. Now we'll talk a bit about what that means. In his left hand, on a lotus throne, often you find a book, of course, which is a book that contains the Prajnaparamita, the wisdom sutras. or sometimes he holds a lotus flower on top of that as well. And not only that, he's riding on a lion. So on the one side of the Shakyamuni, you find Manjushri, Monju Busatsu on a lion. On the other side, you find Fugen Busatsu on an elephant. This lion, if it is colored, it's usually a blue lion. And if there's no lion, then a lion's skin is depicted. Why would there be a lion? And Manjushri is riding the lion. Of course, we can think of royalty because there's always lions involved in China as well. But in this case, sitting on the lion or riding on it is a representation of Manjushri's ability that was developed to tame that lion. To tame that lion, which means to tame that wild mind of ours. To work with it and to get it to work in a way that it will lead us, that we can ride on it wherever we need to ride. So that is Monju Bosatsu. We also know that in many Zen temples, in the Zendo, the Honzon, the main image that you find in the Zendo is Monju Bosatsu, Manjushri. Because when we practice formally in Zazen, there in that hall, you have Manjushri presiding, helping us with that sword of wisdom to cut through ignorance, to cut through delusions, and to cut duality into one. This kind of a presentation of Monju sometimes is called the Shōso Monju. Shōso, which is the holy monk. The holy monk. And if you learn a little bit about the various positions in the Rinzai Zen monastery, you will know, we know the Shoji, of course. The Shoji, that Shoji is a contraction for Shōso Jisha, the person who attends to the holy monk. And that is the case, of course, when the Shoji or the Jisha serves the tea to this image in the Zendo, offering tea, and thus being the attendant. Now, of course, it's not just the Monju statue that receives the tea. All of us as well receive the tea from the Jisha, from the Shoji, which also means that we all are Shōso, holy monks, holy practitioners in training, born with that birthright of being endowed with this Buddha nature. We don't chant it very often in the Rinzai-ji tradition, but in many other places, Hakuin Zenji Zazen Wasan, the Song of Zazen, as it is called, is often chanted. And there the first line is Shujo Honrai Hotoke Nari. All sentient beings are fundamentally Buddhas. So Shōso Monju and the Shoji interact in relationship in the same way that the Jisha, the Shoji, interacts with us in giving us tea. So this is Manjushri who appears here. Manjushri appears in many of the sutras. And it's important to note one of them. There are a couple of very famous lay persons in the Buddhist canon. One of them is Vimalakirti, Yuima in Japanese. The Vimalakirti Sutra is a very interesting sutra where this layman speaks with various bodhisattvas, including Manjushri, about emptiness. And the main teaching, it culminates with the main teaching of Vimalakirti when being asked basically for what is all of this about? What is the teaching of the Buddha? Is silence. The other famous lay practitioner, non-ordained practitioner, is of course Hō-Koji, the layman Pang, who lived in China much later, but is also very important in the history of the Zen tradition. So Manjushri appears in this Vimalakirti Sutra as well. And sometimes there are pictures of Manjushri there. And instead of the sword, sometimes he's also depicted with a nyoi, which is one of those scepters, or a lotus that looks like a scepter and has the lotus flower on the top. We don't do it at Rinzai-ji. We haven't done it at Mount Bali, but there are also traditions of mantras that are being chanted for various bodhisattvas in various services that happen around the Zen monastery. And Monju's mantra would be On Arahashana, On Arahashana. It's repeated 7 times and so on. So all kinds of practices that we find with Manjushris. Let me quote also from one of the sutras, one of the Prajnaparamita sutras, what Manjushri gave as an instruction to us practitioners, what we should be doing in our practice. And so here is the translation. Contemplate the 5 skandhas as originally empty and quiescent, non-arising, non-perishing, equal without differentiation. Constantly thus practicing, day or night, whether sitting, walking, standing, or lying down. Finally, one reaches an inconceivable state without any obstruction or form. This is the samadhi of one act. Ichigyo sammai. Ichigyo sammai. It sounds very much like the Hanya Shingyo, right? The 5 skandhas. Go on. Go on, the 5 skandhas, empty. Non-arising, non-perishing, not defiled, not pure, equal without differentiation, you know? No eyes, no nose, no tongue, no... all of that. Pointing. That's the pointing that Manjushri does. But here, in our koan, Manjushri asks the Buddha to turn the wheel of the Dharma one more time. Well, what does that mean? The turning of the wheel of the Dharma. A little translation into our culture is necessary since we are not informed by the same millennia of Buddhist background. The turning of the wheel is another expression of teaching Dharma according to some Buddhist systems, there were 3 turnings of the wheel. First, the Buddha's first sermons, as recorded in the Tripitaka of the early Buddhist schools, of the Theravada schools. Those teachings are the first turning. So the enunciation of the expression of the Four Noble Truths, of the Eightfold Path, and so on, fall under that first turning. Later, the sutras that focus on the teaching of emptiness, of shunyata, like the Prajnaparamita Sutras, Hahanya Haramita Sutras, they are often referred to as the second turning. And the later teaching of the Yogacara school, the mind-only school, often are described to be the third turning and the ultimate expression of the teachings of the Buddha. So turning of the wheel is teaching. The interesting thing is when we look back at the history of Buddhism, the first images of Buddha were not images of a person. We would find images of the wheel, or then images of the feet, the footprints that were left behind by the world-honored one. But then later, of course, we find statues and depictions of a full body displaying the 32 characteristics of a great person. We also know that when the Buddha awoke under that tree that became the Bodhi tree, the place where Siddhartha, the human being who was just like us, seekers, became the awakened one, he would not speak about anything. He would not explain, because it was impossible for him in the beginning to fathom that it is possible to give any kind of accurate or understandable expression of it. But as over time, he realized that, well, even though I have tasted this awakening, I still see this suffering of all sentient beings. And this is actually referred to here in this koan, where the Buddha admonished Manjushri, after Manjushri asks him to turn the wheel of the Dharma one more time. The Buddha says, for 49 years, I have dwelled in the world. And this world, of course, he wasn't 49 years old. It is 49 years that he had lived in this world of suffering after awakening. So, having dwelt in this world of suffering, he came to the conclusion that he has to say something. And from that saying something comes the reference of turning the wheel for the first time. The wheel of Dharma, the teachings were expounded the first time. And how? Words. Of course, words. Because this is how we human beings communicate. Is it rough? Yes, it's quite rough. Is it subject to misinterpretations, to assumptions, to having different understandings? Of course it is. But out of a deep sense of having to offer something to the Sangha, the wheel was turned. Teachings were expressed. Though in our koan, the Buddha says, for 49 years, I have dwelled in this world, but I've yet to preach a single word. How could that be? After he spoke so often, after his sermons, his exhortations, his elaborations were put down a couple of 100 years later into writing. How is it possible for him to say something like this? Here's a different expression of the same thing from the Diamond Sutra, the Kongo Hanya Haramikyo. In here, in the translation, we can read, if anyone says that the Tathagata presents a teaching, they really slander Buddha and are unable to explain what I teach. As to any truth-declaring system, truth is undeclarable. So, an enunciation of truth is just the name given to it. Same meaning as, but I have yet to preach a single word. We could say Jōshū Roshi did not preach a single word either. Even though we have hundreds, thousands of his talks recorded, not a single word was preached. Everything was the expression of that person and their deep realization and embodiment of that truth of non-duality, of that place where everything is equal and non-different, but still in existence. This non-dual that comes from Manjushri, not only cutting off our delusions of thinking in duality terms, but in cutting that duality into one. There are a couple of really technical things that we have glossed over for a long time in the Western understanding of Buddhism, or in not really going deep into what stands behind this shunyata, this emptiness, for example. I myself remember sometimes expressing it in a way that is not actually accurate, but that was appropriate for the level of my understanding at the time. Shunyata presents a number of chances for human beings to glob onto some understanding that is really not what the Buddhist teachings want to express by speaking about shunyata and emptiness. Way too often, emptiness is just turned into another godlike substance or non-substance. Everything comes from emptiness, everything returns to emptiness. But that's actually not what the Buddha has taught. Very technically speaking, shunyata is just a statement that there is no inherent constancy to any phenomenon that exists. There's no svabhava. That's the other term, svabhava. There is no selfhood. There is no individuality. There is no thing that is constant. What we learn here and what we learn in our sitting practice is that as everything arises, all phenomena are events that constantly unfold. Yet our human mind applies to them words and concepts. We call a table, but it is just an event where different pieces of wood were put together. But by the fact that this arrangement of these pieces of wood serve our human needs as a table, we just call it a table and don't see the dynamic, constantly changing nature of it anymore. And should one of the legs break off, we would declare, this table is broken. But no, it's not, because there is no tableness. What is broken is our idea of what a table is. But reality as such, the events have just continued to evolve, to change, to be not fixated. So, shunyata, no selfhood. And even shunyata itself is not a thing. So even harder, the shunyata of shunyata, the emptiness of emptiness, brings us into that place where we have to encounter the non-dual. It's another concept. What does non-dual mean? Often we think, well, there is darkness and there is light. What does non-duality mean then? And it means only one very, very simple thing. And that is, when it is dark, it is dark. When it is light, it is light. When it is dark and we start thinking, oh my God, I hope it gets light soon. That is when duality comes into existence. The mere thought, the mere bringing up of opposites creates duality. When it is light and we fear that it will get dark again, that also cuts that chasm in between and makes that distance appear, subject and object, and duality comes into existence. Manjushri presides over the Zendo and cuts that into one. Now, dear Buddha, please speak again. Turn the wheel once more, says Manjushri, who already has been engaging in this. Say more, say more. But the Buddha says, well, I have not even preached a single word. You ask me to turn the wheel of the Dharma once again. But have I ever turned the wheel of the Dharma? Zen practice is not talking about. It's not about the teachings. It's not about what the Buddha said. It's not about what Jōshū Roshi said. We can honor these wonderful teachers, but if we get captured by their words, then we are just like flies sitting down on one of those fly catching strips, even if they might smell delicious. When we get trapped on them, our freedom will perish. The words that we remember from our teachers, from the Buddha, from many, many awakened people, male, female, or whatever they might identify themselves in terms of gender, their expression of their being and the embodiment of the truth of non-duality, of the truth of compassion that can only exist on the basis of this non-dual embrace. That is what it's about. And even saying about already pulls it back into 1/10 of an inch further from what it is. So on this first day of the Hō-On Sesshin, let us dedicate ourselves to fully fall into that non-dual space of being truly present, of being fully awake, of encountering this as it unfolds. Our heart may be full of gratitude, but the only way to fully manifest it is to not speak a word, but to be the living exposition of what it means to be an awake, compassionate, open-minded, full-hearted, radiant being.